person has to work out within themselves based on their own ministry and their own circumstances. But the bottom line is that we don't own the things that are around us. And we want to position ourselves to be able to best help God's people. And what the devil wants to do is put us in a position where we ourselves are needy, and we have to become takers rather than givers. And as stewards of stuff and as wise Christians, we want to be in a position where we can help others. And so there's a lot on stewardship in the Bible, and I'd like to start in Luke chapter 16. And this is the parable of the wise manager, but I want to start at the end of the parable, not the beginning of the parable, because the end has kind of the essence of where we're going with this teaching. And so in Luke chapter 16 and in verse 10, it says, "Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is unrighteous in very little is unrighteous also in much." And by the way, unrighteous here, it's like, how can you be unrighteous in very little? Remember that they connected righteousness with doing the law. So basically, in other words, if you're willing to hedge on righteous behavior, that's basically what it would be. If you're willing to give in on to unrighteous behavior in little points, then let's not kid ourselves, then you will tend to do that when there's much as well. And so the one of the things that we've got to keep working on in our society is terrible about this, but we have so much abundance for the most part in American society that we are not sometimes we are not as good stewards as we really need to be. We don't pay attention with the crispness sometimes that we need to. In verse 11, it says, "So if you have," and here, this is really important. "So if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth." Well, looking at all scripture, what's the unrighteous wealth? It's the stuff of the world. It's the things that we have. For the most part, this is stuff that is just the wealth of the world. Of course, we need it, to survive in the world. But if you haven't been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And of course, the true riches really are the great spiritual riches, and also going into eternity, the riches of the kingdom, the rewards, and this kind of thing. And so here's a very sobering, if you want to say that, a very sobering verse. If you haven't been faithful with unrighteous wealth, the stuff that you've been entrusted with in your life, then who's going to commit to you true riches? And verse 12, "And if you've not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give to you that which is your own?" And this actually, there's a kind of a double entendre here, because faithful in that which is another's, in one sense, is what are you handling in your life that belongs to someone else? Do you work for yourself or do you work for somebody else? If you work for somebody else, do you hedge on little things? Or do you really walk a tightrope there and really obey the laws of God? And so that's one thing where we get to handle the wealth of other people. If you borrow money and say you'll pay it back on Friday, do you actually pay it back on Friday? If you borrow a book and say you're going to return it, do you actually return it? That kind of thing. So that's being faithful in that which is another's. But on a larger scope, we don't own anything here. Every single thing we have is God's. And we'll get in. Well, actually, it's just Psalm 24:1. If you want to take a look at Psalm 24:1, "The earth is Yahweh's and all it contains." I mean, if we're down here, if I have a pen, it's Yahweh's. If I have a computer, it's Yahweh's. If whatever I've got, the earth is Yahweh's and everything in it, all that it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. So God's saying, you don't own anything down here. If you haven't been faithful in that which is another's, everything is another's in one sense. Because everything belongs to God, then who will give you that which is your own? So this is kind of the chewy caramel center of where I want to go tonight, which is being faithful in little things. And especially because they don't really belong to us. And especially things that don't belong to us, that really don't belong to us because they belong to somebody else. And how we're really, really careful with that stuff, to walk a really righteous walk. And then it says, then we can be entrusted with the true riches. So I want to back up to the top of the parable now. And you guys, as I look around this group, you guys are familiar with this parable. Let's just read through it. It's Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 1. In the context of this, by the way, you have to back up to Luke 15, but the context of this were the Jews who were, they were money hungry, they had avarice. And so here he's talking and he says, verse 1, and he, Jesus, said to the disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a house manager, and it was reported to him that he was wasting his goods. Now, it's important for the parable that you understand that the parable never says he was wasting his goods, but it was simply reported that he was wasting his goods. And we don't know. He might have been or he might not have been. And it's interesting in the tension of that, because that's not the point of the parable. That in the culture, a lot of times, if you got a bad reputation, you couldn't recover. So the houseman, the rich man, called him and said to him, verse 2, what is this that I hear about you? Give the account of your management, for you're no longer able to manage the house. You're not going to be able to do this anymore. Even if you have done everything right, your reputation has been besmirched. And the house manager said within himself, what should I do, seeing that my Lord is taking away the management from me? I don't have the strength to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I will do, so that when I'm removed from management, people will receive me into their houses. In other words, somebody else is going to pick me up. And calling to him each one of his Lord's debtors, he said to the first, how much do you owe my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly and write 50. And he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said, take your bill and write 80. And the result of this in verse 8 is, and the Lord commended the unrighteous house manager because he'd acted prudently, and prudently, basically wisely. He had acted, and it's not that he acted necessarily to the, deleteriously toward the house owner, because we don't know what the interest rate was and that kind of thing. But then Christ says, well, the sons of this age are in their own generation more prudent than the sons of light. And it's really amazing about this. Like, if you go talk to almost any banker, they will tell you that Christians have a terrible reputation for repaying loans. And a lot of times that's just because Christians have a kind of a lackadaisical attitude about this life. And so we don't need that reputation, and we need to be in a position to help others. And so, when Christ says the people of the world, you watch how they handle their money, you watch how they handle their time, and they can be very, very sharp on that stuff. And then he goes on to verse 9, and this is very important, because, and I myself say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the tents in the age to come. So what is Christ saying here? Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. Well, if the unrighteous wealth here on earth belongs to God, and then we want to make friends out of God and the spiritual world by handling the things in the world with great righteousness and great honesty. And so God's saying here, look, if you will handle the things of the world cleanly, crisply, honestly, when they fail. Well, when do the things of the world fail? Well, It depends on where you are in history's time, but it could be your death. It could be the rapture. And at that point, the things of the world don't mean anything anymore. But then because you have handled things honestly and righteously, we're rewarded in the age to come. The way Christ says it, they will receive you into tents in the age to come. And that's really important to understand, that a lot of times the things of the world, the wealth, the material things, they get a bad reputation. You feel like you're getting your hands dirty and stuff like that. Christ is going in the exact opposite direction. He says, make friends of the unrighteous, unrighteous wealth. Make friends of the unrighteous, right? Use it to your advantage, because it's going to go away. And when it goes away, then, if you've done it right, you're going to be received into the tents in the age to come. You're going to be welcomed. You're going to be rewarded. And again, that was verse 9. And then where we started in verse 10, and verse 11 says, if you haven't been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who's going to commit to your trust the true riches? What I'd like to do is I'd like to go to another parable Christ taught. And this, he actually taught it twice in two different ways. He taught it in Matthew and he taught it in Luke. And in Matthew, one person got 5 talents, another 2, another 1. In the Luke record, there were 10 different people and each one got 1 mina. And then it depended on what they did with their 1 mina. So you have these 2 parables teach the same lesson. So let's do the Matthew one. So that's Matthew chapter 25. And in Matthew chapter 25, we're going to start in verse, I believe it's 16, maybe not. We'll see. Matthew 25, verse 14. Yeah. So Matthew 25:14, and he starts out and he says, for the kingdom of heaven is like when a man going on a journey called his own slaves and entrusted his property to them. By the way, in the parables of Christ, when there's a lord, a man, a homeowner, any of those people, go back and reflect and work your way through it. That's always God. So here, the man going on a journey is God. And his slaves are those of us here on earth. And he entrusted his property. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. And that's an interesting thing too, because we each have different abilities, different ministries. And it's important that we use our talents in that way. And verse 16 says, immediately the one who received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. Likewise, the one who received the 2 gained 2 more. But the one who received the 1, having gone out, dug in the earth and hid his Lord's money. Verse 19, after a long time, the Lord of those slaves comes and settles accounts with them. And the one who received the 5 talents came and brought 5 more talents, saying, Lord, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I've gained 5 more talents. His Lord said, well done, good and faithful slave. You've been faithful over a few things. I will set you over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Notice how he says, I've set you over a few things. This is back to the parable we read in Luke 16, where if you're faithful in little, God will entrust to you much. Same basic lesson, different parable. And that's one of the things that I saw as I was working this stuff over the last few days, is that the same lessons kept coming up over and over and over again. And I kind of had to sit back and meditate on that for a while, because it was really, instead of the 4 Gospels being, you got to memorize every individual verse, it was like, wow, there's lessons and themes that we can get a hold of that are really important, central, and germane. And one of them is, if you're faithful with a little, then God will give you a lot. And so the same thing goes. And down verse 24, the one who received the 1 talent also came and said, Lord, I know that you I knew you that you are a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter. And I was afraid, and I went away and hid your talent in the earth. See, you have what is yours. But his Lord answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I have not sowed, and I gather where I did not scatter. Then you needed to deposit my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. And then he says to ostensibly the people who are standing around, therefore take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. Verse 29, for to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from the one that does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless slave out into the darkness outside. There will be sobbing and gnashing of teeth. Now this verse 29, is pretty amazing. Let's take a look at that again. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from the one that does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And this seems really harsh, and in fact, seems contradictory to what we know about the love of God. And we need to understand here that there is things going on in the culture behind the scenes that are basically what it's saying is to everyone who has. Well, let me back up a little bit. First of all, this statement, to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. From the one that does not have, even what he has will be taken away. This statement, Christ made this statement 5 different times in the Gospels. And no duplications. 5 different times. I mean, that's pretty amazing. There aren't too many things that Christ taught where he made the same statement 5 different times. I'm trying to think of the times. I know, I think it's Matthew 13:12, Mark 4 something, Luke 16, and anyway, 5 different times that Christ made this same statement. And in each case, he never said has what. For everyone who has. He didn't say for everyone who has money, for everyone who has wealth, for everyone who has whatever. Every single time it occurs, it's simply for everyone who has. And the biblical understanding was that if you had whatever it was, it could be wealth, but it could be wisdom. It could be joy. It could be love. It could be friends. Whatever it is, that the one who has, and then the understanding, the unspoken understanding behind the verse is the reason that you have is that you've been able to steward the resources at your command. And that's why you have. It's not, this is not saying that if, here's a guy and he's, because it's not talking about, and I should say this, in none of the contexts, including here in Matthew 25, including Luke 16, about the minas, in none of the contexts is it really talking about material things. It's talking about what you have inside of you, what God has given you, what you are bringing to the table. And so the person that has, why do you have? It's because you've made good choices and you've lived a godly life. In this particular context, why does the guy have 10 talents? Because he made good choices, lived a godly life. In the Luke thing, why does the guy have 10 minas? Because he made good choices, lived a godly life. So that's what's behind this. To the one who has what? Has whatever he has. Friends, joy, love, peace, money, whatever. He has it because he's lived a godly life and has made good choices, and then more is going to be given to them. And that's a great promise for us, because it's, what we're back to the original where I started. If you've been faithful in that which is another's, you'll get more stuff given to you. So here, to everyone who has, and you have because your godly life and your good choices, then hey, you know what? You're going to get more. And to those who do not have, like in this context, the guy that didn't make anything with the money he was given, why didn't he have? Ungodly life, poor choices. And you know what? I don't care what you've got. I don't care what it is that you've got, but you start living an ungodly life and make poor choices, and it's going to be taken away. That's what Christ is saying here. If you don't have, even what he has will be taken away. So this sentence here, which Christ basically repeats 5 times in 5 different places in the Gospels, is really, it's an encouragement to people who want to live a godly life and want to make godly choices because they know they're going to get more, and eventually that more is going to be the true riches entrusted to them by God. And it's a warning to the people that are making bad choices and living an ungodly life, that's a downhill slope. And eventually people are going to lose what they have, absolutely. And so kind of making a shift then, well, what are some of the ungodly choices that people make? And one of the fruit of the Spirit, as you know, in the whole fruit of the Spirit list, love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, kindness, meekness, and then self-control. And self-control is the last thing on the list. And self-control a lot of times is what keeps us from making bad choices. And I was thinking about some of the things the world is so tantalizing. Your life will be better if you have a newer cell phone. Your life will be better if you have a bigger TV. Your life will be better if you have a fancy car. Your life will be better if you have stylish clothes. Your life will be better if. And there's a constant pressure from the world to get you to spend money rather than build wealth. And I'm not saying it's not a good thing to have a nice car or clothing, but but we have to be careful as Christians about what we spend our money on. We have to be aware of the fact that when the advertisers come out and they advertise a new cell phone or they advertise a fancy car or whatever it happens to be, that's for them. They're doing that for them. They're not doing that for us. Absolutely. The world is designed to make you feel unsatisfied with what you have. And our job is to feel satisfied with what we have, as long as it's adequate. We just feel satisfied with what we have. Luke chapter 12, verse 15, Christ said, "Take care and be on guard against every form of greediness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of things he possesses." And that's really true. We want to be on guard with that. And then Ecclesiastes chapter 5. If we look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, I'll start in verse 20. And there's a real interesting section on wealth here and stewardship. Ecclesiastes 5:20 says, "The one who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver." If you have money or silver because you do things with it, then you're going to be satisfied. But if you simply love silver, you never have enough. You never be satisfied. And that's one of the reasons, again, we want to self-control. We curb our appetites. Nor will the one who loves wealth be satisfied with his income. This too is pointless. And then it says, "The sleep of a laboring man," verse 12, "is sweet, whether he eats little or much. But the abundance of the rich will not allow them to sleep." And that's really true. Sometimes we get overcome with stuff and we have a hard time stewarding it. And then he says, verse 13, "There's a grievous evil that I've seen under the sun. Wealth kept by its owner to his harm." And that's something that the world will never tell you. The world will never say, by the way, that stuff that you own, it can hurt you. Now, if you can steward it and steward it well, that's great. But we've got to be aware Like I knew a guy one time, and he was a car collector, and he had all these cars. There's nothing wrong with being a car collector, but in his case, it took a huge amount of his time where he was keeping up with the cars, dusting the cars, polishing the cars. It's like, wait a minute, really? I mean, is there any kind of reward at the judgment seat for polishing cars? Every time you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. If you're saying yes to polishing a car, you may be saying no to helping out your neighbor. You might be saying no to reading the Bible. You might be saying no to taking personal time for prayer, or personal time for reflection, or journaling time, or whatever it is. It's just in stewarding our life and stewarding our time, we've got to be aware that saying yes to one thing is saying no to another. So when we start out with a blank slate at the beginning of the day, and we write down, what are the things I want to get done today? What are the things I need to do? Need to take time to pray. Need to take time to read the Bible. Need to take time for myself. Well, if you've got so much stuff that you can't do that, then you're right here where Ecclesiastes is, that wealth kept by its owner to his harm. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to be unwise in that way. Absolutely. And another thing that a lot of times, when you have, when you're not stewarding things properly, then you get anxious. And of course, Philippians 4:6, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petitions with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And then the peace of God, which passes understanding, will guard your hearts and your thoughts. And being peaceful is incredibly valuable. Hard to even talk about that. So I want to basically along with the peace, then being content with what we own. Lots and lots of verses about being content. Probably one of the biggest is 1 Timothy 6. Godliness with contentment is great gain. 1 Timothy 6, verse 7. For we brought nothing into the world, neither are we to carry anything out. And that makes perfect sense because we don't own it. It's all God's. So he said, look, when you got here, you didn't have anything. When you left, you're not taking anything. It's all mine. And all we really get are the things that God gives us later at the judgment seat. Absolutely. And verse 8, 1 Timothy 6:8 says, but if we have food and covering, we'll be content with that. And then what I want to close with is, okay, what is one of the sure things that I can do to build wealth in the future? And I'm not talking about a retirement account. I'm talking about what the epistles talk about when they say that you will receive a rich welcome into the kingdom. And here's Paul, he's in jail. He's writing to the Philippians. He needs support. And he writes in Philippians 4:15, now you Philippians also know that in the beginning of the good news, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you alone. Even in Thessalonica, you sent gifts more than once for my need. Not that I seek a gift, but I seek the fruit that accumulates to your account. And when we give to others, when we give to the work of the Lord, when we help other people out, that is fruit that abounds to our account. And I'll close with Proverbs 19:17, which says, Proverbs 19:17, the one who shows favor to a poor person lends to Yahweh, and he will repay him according to his good work. So when you help out the poor and you see that money leaving your wallet and going into the hands of some poor person, and that's money gone. Well, actually, no, it's not. You just loaned it to Yahweh. Well, Yahweh's going to repay his debt. And so when you get to the judgment seat, Yahweh's going to hand you a bunch of stuff. You're like, what's this? And this is all the stuff that I borrowed from you. Really, you borrowed from me? Yeah. He who shows favor to the poor person lends to Yahweh, and he will repay him according to his good work. You never have to be concerned that if you give something away, whatever it happens to be, your time, your resources, whatever it happens to be, that when you give to help poor people and God's people, that you are lending to Yahweh and he will repay you. So in a closing statement for this teaching, basically, I think you guys are probably where I am, that I want to be trusted with the good riches, what God calls the true riches in Luke 16. And I'm trying to get sharper on the fact that the stuff that I don't own it. It's all God's. And my job is to steward it, and it's to steward it without cheating, without hedging my bets, without taking things that belong to others and hoping that no one sees, and that kind of thing. Because I really want to set my face for the goal of receiving rewards at the judgment seat. And God has shown us how to do it. He owns everything. We just need to steward it. So I'd love to open the floor for discussion. So